Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Fifth Estate. My name's Sally Warhaft, and we're here to discuss tonight one of the most divisive, vexing and difficult problems in our national life. That's asylum seekers. It's a subject that seems to occupy an enormous amount of time and thought, from our landlocked national capital to all our borders of our continent. And it's already, of course, dominating this year's federal election pre-campaign. Joining me to talk this through is Peter Reith. He is, of course, the former Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party. He was the Minister for Workplace Relations and Australia's 48th Defence Minister from 2000 until his retirement at the 2001 election. Peter, of course, was a key architect of the Pacific solution, which ensured that asylum seekers were processed offshore. Also, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Dan Mori, now retired Lieutenant Colonel Michael Dan Mori. Dan served in the United States Marine Corps for almost 30 years and, of course, is best known to all of you, I'm sure, as the Defence Counsel for David Hicks when he was in Guantanamo Bay Prison. He's here on a 457 visa. He's now living in Melbourne. He's working for Shine Lawyers on human rights and social justice cases, including asylum seekers. They're just about to let him practice as an actual lawyer. And give him and Peter Reith a very warm welcome, please. So I want to start, I guess the thing that perplexes me the most about this issue in Australia is that it's become so dominant. It's so puzzling to me that asylum seekers arriving in boats has become so political as well. And I think it seems that that's made it a much harder problem for politicians to solve. How has what could have been a comparatively minor political issue come to have such a massive impact on our politics? Peter, I might start with you.
Well, I suppose I would start to answer that by saying that, what are the issues that become political issues? And, there are lots of things, lots of issues which don't get much public scrutiny, and it's hardly surprising to say that, well, the ones you don't hear about are the ones where they all agree. There are lots of very important issues, and I've sat around a cabinet table and, the thing that was the most important has slipped through very quickly because there's not much argument about it. When there's not much argument about it, either within a party or between parties, and obviously between parties is what we're talking about, but where there's not a lot of conflict or difference of opinion, or where there are issues which are, shall we say, readily resolved, they just don't hit the sort of public arena in terms of debate. So the first thing to say is that where you have differences of opinion and outstanding and issues of, which go on and on and on, as it were, in terms of the time, merely the time, that in itself is one explanation for why this issue is still here. And the reason, so I'd put it this way, for many Australians, it's an issue that has yet to be reconciled or resolved in some way at the political level.
It was an issue at the political level, though, that in the 1970s was bipartisan when Malcolm Fraser sought to help the Vietnamese refugees. I think 50,000 of them. It was bipartisan. At what point did you drift so far apart, the Liberal and Labor parties, from each other?
Well, there was quite an unreconciled immigration debate going into the 96 election. And the reason it wasn't reconciled is that there'd been quite a shift in the makeup of the immigration profile. And what we were seeing was quite a lot of people coming in, or a disproportionate number of people coming in under the family schemes. And as a result of that, we had quite a bigger proportion than usual of people who weren't ending up with jobs because they didn't have the skills or capacity to get into the employment market. And so, our side were pretty critical of the hawk management on the immigration. If you go back to Vietnam, I think there are quite a lot of differences with Vietnam. Now, obviously, I wasn't involved in politics in those days, but the fact that we took a lot of people from Vietnam was also a reflection of the fact that our taking of people into Australia was not just an Australian view of the world. It was part and parcel of an understanding that was achieved between Australia, the US, and I suppose, and some of the other participants in Vietnam. But I mean, we were an important player in that, not numerically, but in terms of support for the Vietnam War. And there certainly was an understanding that we had an obligation to take our fair share, and we did take proportionately, I think, on a numerical basis, as many, if not more, than the Americans. So it certainly was a different situation.
It certainly was.
There's some similarities too. Obviously, following the Vietnam conflict, there was a huge exodus of people needing protection in a new life, and it's similar to what's going on now, and at least from Iraq, and the conflict there was going to breed or increase the asylum seekers, refugee seekers. Same in Afghanistan, and probably some of the destabilization in other countries in the area, Iran.
What do you make of the political debate here as an American coming to now live in Australia? You've lived here for over a year. You've known Australia for a long time.
Well, I think for anybody that's familiar with the United States, we've had our challenges and struggles in conflicts and arguments about what to do with our borders. And obviously the border with Mexico has been a hot issue for since we took away part of Mexico and made it America. But that's the reality. I mean, it's probably very similar motivations for people across the border. It's obviously a lot easier, but just recently in the U.S., where they're looking at passing laws again to build more of a wall and to double the border security to keep that sort of work population that's coming across that border in and out, keep them out, or to try to regulate it, because there needs to be a process. Can't have a border that's so porous that people can just come and go.
Well, that's the tension, isn't it? There's sovereignty, and then there's a humanitarian obligation. Does the tone of our political debate reflect that appropriately, Peter? Do you think it's okay the way asylum seekers are spoken about in our society?
Well, I think people's concerns about the way in which things are debated can be a bit exaggerated. Their concerns, I think, are a bit exaggerated. Look, there's no doubt. I mean, you see stuff pushed through on the email that shouldn't go anywhere, basically, and claims are made and statements are made which are completely over the top.
There's an everyday language, though, too, that is at times dehumanising.
Well, look, I hear that, but I suppose I put it in this, whilst acknowledging your point to a degree, the first thing I'd say is that we shouldn't, however, put to one side the fact that Australia has had a pretty good and built a pretty good reputation as a country that values a humanitarian approach to some of these issues. I mean, it's not as if, we have a bad record in terms of being prepared to take people. I mean, we are prepared to take people. We're prepared to support them when they get here, compared to many others, but Australia's record's not too bad. I mean, you can argue we could do more, and that's fine. By all means, have that debate. But it shouldn't be put to one side as if, we haven't had a good record here. I mean, the fact of the matter is, okay, you might say some of the Norwegians and there are some others, the Dutch, I think, have probably a better record than we do, but we're still in the top 10 or 15. I mean, there are all sorts of numbers that I've seen over the years as to how you compare the efforts that Australia's made, but it's not a bad record. I'm also a little bit cautious because in being too sort of judgmental. I mean, some people who perhaps don't follow the issue very carefully perhaps are not as sensitive to some of the language around this debate. But I think we should be wary about dismissing somebody's concerns on some of these issues because, there are a lot of people, we may not agree with them. We might think that they've got an attitude that, is not sort of what we'd like to see or encourage. But, in a democracy, you can't walk away from what people have to say and what their real concerns are. Now, that's not to give a tick to a sort of Hansonite approach to immigration or anything else, but I think, at the political level, you do have an obligation to hear what everybody's got to say. And so I just finished by saying this. I mean, I've certainly been criticised, as being, using the wrong words, etc. And sometimes that might have been fair comment. Sometimes it hasn't been. The claim has often been made, "Oh, you demonise people." Well, people throw that claim around, but I don't think that is the sort of standard approach. Quite frankly, at the political level, I think it's a bit unfair for people to claim it. But they do, and they're entitled to say what they want to say.
Dan, does the language matter? Does it?
Well, I mean, I think it does. If you look at it historically on the issue of taking people from one country in conflict and taking them somewhere else, if you think about a historic example, there's the Underground Railroad in the U.S. and they're looked on as heroes. The smuggling of Jews out of Germany. They weren't people smugglers, right? We don't look back on the people who got people out of that conflict and call them people smugglers. They're heroes. Now, everybody that's trying to help people, they're being labeled as people smugglers, and maybe they will be now, but they'll be seen later in a different language. I think that's an interesting historical when you look back on conflicts and people that have helped people get out of the areas where they're concerned for their safety. Mm-hmm. But there still has to be a process. I think that's the challenge, isn't it? Finding out that process, how to take people and relocate them efficiently and effectively.
Do you think, though, Peter, it's out of proportion, this debate, as I said in the start, that it's just... how many people actually know somebody or how many people's lives have actually been affected by somebody who arrived in Australia on a boat, and yet it dominates as much airtime?
Can I save you for a second, Peter?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, absolutely. Part
of the fault lies with the media. Unfortunately, it's a much more interesting story if you've got a boat bobbing around and people in the water. The reality is the stats are more asylum seekers potentially arriving by other means than boats. Yet the media really loves the boat stories. And that's I think one of the reasons why it's getting overplayed and becomes a hot issue politically, because the media keeps wanting it to be. I hate to blame the media for everything, but
look, I love to blame them if I get half a chance, because they're a pain in the neck. But no, look, I think there's a sort of, you can say, oh well, it's only 30,000 people a year at the moment, or 36,000, depending on what the numbers are, but. Well, first of all, I'd say is that actually those numbers are probably twice as much as that, because once people are established here, they do have entitlements to bring family out, etc. So, if you've got an intake of 40,000 a year, it's going to be 80,000 a year. As just taking a presumption of one additional person per arrival. The fact is that. Well, we know now that there's a lot of those people who are coming into Australia today are not getting jobs. and that's simply because they don't have the skills and the capacity or the language to do so. Now, look, there are plenty of societies where people have arrived in Australia without a penny, without the language, and they've, ended up as being good citizens, and their families have, thrived and prospered, etc., etc. But, when the economic circumstances are sort of toughening up a bit, which they are in Australia, people, a lot of people say, well, there's a cost involved in this and we're going to end up paying it. So that is an issue. That's just a plain, blunt economic issue, which you can't avoid. And I think it's also wrong to look at it numerically and say, well, it's not that big an issue. You see, I think it is a big issue. And the reason I think it's a big issue is that, personally, I'm in favour of a strong migration program. I think this country can take more people. I think this country needs more people.
How many more?
Well, I don't really have a number, but if there's a scale from 1 to 10, I'm sort of down, one end, which is basically, the bigger Australia. I mean, I'm with Kevin, on that one. Now, the thing that particularly concerns me about the boat people goes to this broader policy issue. And the point I make is that, look, most Australians, leaving aside Indigenous Australians, most Australians are migrants themselves, this generation or previous generation. The Australian public basically are pretty happy to have more migrants coming to Australia because they've experienced that themselves. So, over time, there's a well of support for immigration to Australia. The only time that you see the support for migration falling is when the public look at the process by which people come to Australia and they lose confidence in the management of the scheme. And this is the thing that concerns me.
Can you really make that assumption, though, that that's why people have turned away from... and in fact, in recent years, it's been recent migrants who have actually also turned their back on asylum seekers as much as any other group. How can you say it's the process? How do we know that it isn't a whole mix of things, one of them perhaps being that, another being perhaps where people are coming from? There's a whole...
Yeah, look, obviously there's more than one, aspect to it. I'm sure that's right. And look, I don't come here as a, statistician with all the numbers, but we've had this in the past where, and it's a fact under the Hawke years, if you went out, if you take the polling results, there's just no doubt about it. As the disproportionate numbers came in that weren't getting work, people were concerned about the economic situation, and there were quite substantial reductions in public support for immigration. And we've had a similar fall back this time. Now, you might be right, there might be other factors at work, but the evidence that I've seen certainly supports the proposition. And to me, quite frankly, it makes common sense. If people look at the system and feel that it's not being properly managed, then they're a bit worried about how many more we're going to take. And, there is an issue I think, for everybody, and that is that by all means, Australia could be and should be and has been a country that is generous in taking people, but there is some limit to that. Now, I don't necessarily know what that limit is. You asked me, how big is the migration program that's going to be acceptable to the Australian public? But I can guarantee you this, there is some level at which the Australian public will say, well, we're prepared to take so many, but we're not prepared to take so many as to impact upon the way in which Australia is run today. And let me just give you one simple example, particularly in respect of employment. We already have this argument with the 457s. We've got that running now. To me, it's the propositions that have gone through the Parliament recently are just xenophobia, quite frankly. And I think it's disappointing that we should have such policy shifts in the last few weeks. But there's absolutely no doubt that the Australian public is that they have a limit. And I mentioned the trade union movement because the fact is, if you get a lot of people into the country and for reasons not of their making, but if the reality is that it's hard for them to get any jobs other than low-skilled jobs, then quite frankly, we don't have a labour market system that really provides for those people.
Although, of course, if they're not taking that's one of the arguments about, asylum seekers are going to take our jobs.
Yeah. I'm not running that argument. That's the ACTU running it.
Well, the problem is that many of the asylum seekers that are being processed within Australia are banned from working.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
they get banned from working. They get condemned for not financially supporting themselves, and they're caught in this horrible position.
Yeah. No, I've just got this.
It's got miracles.
Yeah, well, I know. I've got the numbers on this.
Oh, he's got the numbers.
Well, you may not believe them. They're in the Australian, so I suppose, that's a matter of opinion, I suppose. But sorry. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think they got it from the stats, and I'll find it in a minute. But
Dan,
but just to finish this point, though, I mean, by all means. If we're going to bring people into this country, then they're entitled to a job as much as anybody else. But if we have a labour market that prevents them from getting a job, then, that is a big issue. I tell you, that is a really big issue. What do you say about that?
Well, no, I agree. There needs to be, as growth with population, there needs to be job supporting. But there are a lot of jobs still out there and available. If you open the paper every day, and they are low-skilled jobs. And historically, if you look at the migration of people to the United States, I mean, the Irish took certain jobs, the Italians took certain jobs, the Germans did certain jobs, and as the populations came in, they usually started at the bottom and worked up, generationally.
Yep.
And I think the parents here, you see they're coming from other countries that have families, they're driving the cabs, and they've got 3 kids, and they're hoping all 3 of those kids go to university.
Yep.
And I think it may take a generation, but they usually...
see, Dan, I mean, quite frankly, I'm an admirer of the US system from a labour market point of view, because the labour market in the US is a hell of a lot more flexible than it is here. You have lower, minimum requirements here, hourly rates.
All right, I'm going to move on from that.
You do pay better here in Australia.
We're not going to.
You pay better in Australia.
We pay higher. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, Peter, I'm not going to turn this into a discussion about the relative labour markets of both
but
places.
It's a big thing for anybody who wants a job.
I want to move towards what we do with asylum seekers that either reach Australian shores or don't. About what do we do, Dan, between that balance of sovereignty and humanitarian? Should it be onshore processing? Should it be offshore processing? How do we go about...
solve the problem in one quick answer?
Assuming you can't solve it completely, that people will always...
I think there's 2 separate issues. There is the processing and the location, and then there's the detention and the conditions of detention and confinement. And I think they've got to be sort of separated out. Most of the work I've done since I've been here has been dealing with detention and the conditions of detention. And offshore processing is a viable solution if the location is a safe location and it's a safe place for the individuals to be held and processed. Unfortunately, the options are limited, and it can be very expensive. I don't know if Peter disagrees with offshore. I mean, some people may, and I've gotten kind of an argument at work when I say, what's wrong with offshore?
Really, Peter, the Pacific solution was, I think, you were a key player in that.
Well, John Howard sent me to Nauru to negotiate with Renee Harris, I think was the president then, to see if they would be prepared to for us to set up a detention centre there, which we did. One of the sort of, very sort of basic proposition in terms of the offshore was that, as the issue arose, the Howard government was determined to make it very clear to people that if you tried to get to Australia, you wouldn't get there. And that was the that was one reason for having offshore and going to Nauru. It was just a very clear message. We understand that people want to get to Australia by boat, but it is not the policy of the Australian government to encourage that in any way, shape or otherwise. And hence that's why I was sent to Nauru to set it up, basically. And quite frankly, it was a very successful policy, because together with the other elements of the policy at the time, there's no question that the boat stopped. And we can debate the morality of it all, but the fact of the matter is, in the alternative policy that we've had in the last 4 or 5 years, nearly 1,000 people have drowned on their way here.
Well, yeah, but
and the like.
It doesn't mean you stop debating the morality of it. You went to...
Well, it's a fair counterweight.
You went to Indonesia and Afghanistan last year with the SPS program. Go back to where you came from. How did that alter, if in any way, your sense of this? I mean, how can you exclude a moral argument from an issue like this at any point? Doesn't it always
who's
have to be?
excluded a moral
well,
argument?
You've said that you can worry about the moral argument, or presumably not worry about it. The boat stopped, and that that in itself is achieved.
Well, I didn't think I put it that way. I mean, well, look, I'm open to be criticised if someone wants to get up and say so.
I'm asking you to talk
fair enough
about
for a discussion.
Is just simply stopping the boats a solution? Is that?
Well, that's not the end of the matter. I mean, Australia has a humanitarian intake. So it's not a matter of, that's the end of the issue. No more interest, in the circumstances of people who are being persecuted, for eons in various, in Africa or somewhere else, who are stuck in a detention centre and, someplace in the middle of Africa, and whose chances to get to Australia have been minimised by the fact that other people have flown into Malaysia, bribed somebody at the airport, got themselves on a boat to Indonesia and turned up in Australia. Now, I mean, so it's to say stopping the boats is somehow the end of the matter. I don't say that. I've never said that. And in fact, personally, I've had no particular problem with the idea of increasing the intake either. It's 13,000 at the moment. The Coalition's policy is not to agree to the increase to the 20. I'm not myself opposed to an increase to the 20, but I do accept the concern that the Australian public generally have, which is they're just not, to go back to my basic proposition, which is the public are not all that keen on an increase if they feel that the situation continues not to be managed. So,
well, you were talking about the morality and asking that question on just the whole refugee issue in a way, and part of it is, I would say, I think about it, and when I see it, is for everyone that makes it here, there's probably 100 in their home country that have it worse. And if we're 90% that apply actually get found to be refugee status, if I'm correct on my stats around there. So, what is our obligation if people are being here or staying because we're finding that they're facing persecution in a particular country? What are we doing about trying to stop that country that's persecuting its population? And, but I mean, when you talk about the morality of immigration, regardless of what country, there is an obligation for us, humanitarian, to help people out there and struggling. But shouldn't we be doing more over there in a way? I don't want to say we don't want people to come to other countries, but let's solve the problem there if it can be done, so that they can stay in their own country. And I know that may be idealistic, but
well, it's not totally idealistic. I mean, look, Australia and a whole lot of other first world countries do spend a hell of a lot of money. I mean, again, you could say they could spend more, fair enough, but there's a hell of a lot of effort and a lot of money and time and effort put into trying to do something for people who are being persecuted in their country of origin. And look, if we could all sort of have a magic wand and fix the world's problems, that'd be great. But the truth is we're not going to. And in terms of immigration, sure, we can do more. But, you're asking me about going to Afghanistan. we were debating this all the way, but eventually you get to this point. You say, well, look, at which point do you say that we've taken as many as we reasonably sort of, feel that we should? Now, whether it's 20,000 or 50,000, then you have to ask yourself, well, if after 50,000, person number 50,001 arrives, what do you do? Well, I don't have the moral answer to that question, but I can say to you, and I think most Australians would agree, there is a limit somewhere. There is some point at which,
I think,
we have to say we've done all that we reasonably can.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but even you say, I think we could do more, suppose we could do more, then shouldn't somebody in your position, where you've had a really unique take on this, you were the Defence Minister, you were incredibly involved in setting the tone of a debate from 2001, post-Tampa. You also had the experience of going to Afghanistan, and I saw a bit of that series, and I felt that you were moved by what you saw and experienced in that trip, as anybody would be. If you say, sure, we could do more, then shouldn't you be saying we should be doing more? And at what point, until that, there's even a blurry edge of where that line is.
In the end, there aren't too many blurry edges when you actually have to make a decision. That's it. But can I just go back to the trip? I mean,
yep.
Look, if people ask me, did it change my view? Well, it sort of did and it didn't. It's not much of an answer, I suppose. But, I met young kids, for example, who'd been on fishing vessels bringing asylum seekers to Australia and then getting picked up by the coppers basically in Australia and being put in jail. Now that, quite frankly, I think is completely over the top. It's unreasonable. These are kids who know nothing about anything, quite frankly. They don't know who they're moving, why they're moving. All they know is that, if you're working on a boat off Indonesia, you get $1 a week or whatever it is. It's a minuscule amount, and somebody comes along and offers you 10 times as much, and you've got nothing in terms of any resources of any sort, and they get, caught by the people smugglers. And I think throwing these kids in jail, quite frankly, is not a good idea for Australia, and I don't think it's a humane way of treating young people who, quite frankly, have no real understanding of what's happened to them. So, that's one example. I went to a camp in Kabul and saw a young woman with 3 children. Her husband was an addict. They'd been in that camp for like 10 years. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, women are treated very badly. I mean, and, we looked at what other things might Australia be able to do to help these people? And I think there were some things that could be done, and we, put forward some suggestions and the like. But it's never enough. But as a humane country, let's do as much as we can. But I do know this also at the political level. You can't, whatever you might feel about it, you also have an obligation to try and understand what the general public view is, because you have to have the public go with you. That's the whole thing about a democracy. You have to have some sort of social license, social support, call it what you like, for the propositions that you advance. And otherwise, what happens? If you don't take decisions taking account of what the public think, I tell you what, you open the door to extremists.
But politics sets the tone for that too.
Sorry?
Politicians set the tone for that. So,
yeah.
I mean, there are a whole variety of ways something like the NDIS could have been put to the Australian people. It was put in a bipartisan, measured, unhysterical. Part of the problem, it seems to me, is the tone of this. It's why I started by asking you both about language. That it's out of control now. I think on both sides, to a point where even, leadership and education, the great motherhood sort of problem solvers of everything we like to think, it seems impossible that either of those two things could work. It's about policy and cooperation now, and you do not see it on this issue in a way that in Parliament on issues of great concern to humanity you get a conscience vote. There's no sense of Parliament, of politicians working together to convince people that it's more important to solve this problem than it is to get votes out of it. Dan?
Oh, yeah. Maybe it's one of those issues that's just easily used by political parties to motivate their supporters, to either through fear of outsiders or taking a stand on their side. It just seems to be a divisive issue that has been utilized and ping-ponged back and forth by.
So what do you do?
I don't know if there is a real solution unless the politicians are going to agree to say that we need to come together and find a solution to speed up processing, to create an effective and humane detention process, which it's a challenge, and I wish I had that magic wand. And I know it's not an easy solution. That's why it's been able to linger and fester, and the media loves reporting about it, and it loves there to be conflict, and loves to say, look at the two sides fighting about this issue.
Yeah, but I mean, look, I understand that, but and it's commonplace. I mean, people sort of reel from the idea of the pollies going at it, hammer and tong. But I mean, on a lot of issues, if the public really want to know about an issue, the way they're going to know about it is to hear the arguments on both sides. And they might like to take a bit of a step back. But I tell you what, the alternative is you get the pollies all to agree all of the time. And I tell you what, that would be a disaster. So it's somewhere there's got to be a balance. And look, I know I'm an ex-politician, so you might say, well, I'm sort of jaundiced or biased or whatever. But, I still look at Australia and say it's a pretty good democracy for all its faults. And look, I think, you certainly can have examples, and I've, had a go at the 4, 5, 7s as one example. But again, my experience, for what it's worth, please feel, free to boo me if you want to. But, there we go. I asked for it. Yeah. But, honestly, most of the people I know in the federal parliament, that they don't spend all their time trying to, set up division, to win a few extra voters or whatever. I mean, seriously, I know a lot of people mightn't believe me, but most of the people I know are genuinely interested in trying to settle these issues. And the fact is, some of these things are sort of irreconcilable, really hard. It's
a polarizing issue.
Yeah.
And the language, and I'm not, there is sort of, I think clearly it was bad timing with the whole September 11th happening at that time, and the ethnicity of the recent influx of people, and that fed the individuals' hysteria potentially about it.
But take this issue about the turn back the boats. I mean, the press this morning, I don't know whether it's true or not. I mean, the claim was, Kevin Rudd might be thinking about whether he might go down that track at some stage. Well, I don't know whether he is or he isn't, but I mean, to me, should be a fairly straightforward issue. You can either do it or you can't do it. It's either a good idea or it's not a good idea.
It's illegal.
Sorry?
It's illegal.
It's I hear what you say. I don't believe that it's illegal for the Australian government to turn back a boat which is entering into Australian waters. And
hang on, we're going to get to questions soon. No, I'm sorry, you can't yell out. This is going to be a podcast as well, so people will just be able to hear a lot of yelling. And we will have questions very shortly.
I suppose I'm sort of a bit, I sort of got the Nauru thing in my mind because I was like, by the way, I wasn't here from 2001 onwards. I left, which I'm not...
I can't imagine why, Peter.
Well, actually, I was lucky. I had one of those jobs for the boys and I just got it out of my system for 6 years, thank you very much, and came back to it not so long ago. But, when I came back, there was... The Labor Party are saying, they closed Nauru and then they said they weren't going to open it. And then after a while, they did open it. Now, to me... It's a bit like this turning back the boats, leaving aside the legal arguments. I mean, to me, why couldn't it be I mean, they say it won't work. I mean, if they really think it won't work, why don't they give it a try? I mean, to me, it's not an unreasonable thing. And politically, quite frankly, I would have thought they'd be a lot smarter to try it. And if it doesn't work, well, then they can say, well, we've done our best. I mean, it's a bit the same with TPVs. To me, I don't quite get why, it's such a huge issue for Labor not to agree to that. I mean, it's part of a package of things. But for some reason, like Nauru, you just can't get them to get to it. But it wouldn't surprise me in the next few weeks if they decide to do it anyway.
Is there anything you would have done differently with the benefit of time? I mean, you've acknowledged in the past that you made mistakes, that everybody made mistakes in this area. What would you do differently?
Well, I'm not really so sure about that. I mean, I've sort of been, attacked left, right and centre over the children overboard thing. So by all means, pick me up on that at some stage, and always happy to talk about all of these things. But
a policy, something to do with policy.
The basic policy was we're going to stop the boats, and we did. Now, I'm not sure what else we should have done, quite frankly. I mean, I haven't really heard any sort of propositions that there was any other way to manage it. I mean, Australia's not the only country to have to deal with this situation. There's loads of other places that have had all sorts of similar sort of issues.
Well, indeed, most of the countries that take most asylum seekers on earth are desperately poor.
That's a good point, is that most of the countries that are having these refugee camps are much poorer than
Dan, on your side, on the side of advocacy, it's the lack of solutions, it's the lack of alternative, clear solutions that's often
it is, but it's also the
that.
detention. It's the type of detention, the condition that people are held in, and children. We act for one 15-year-old who's detained probably, and it's the conditions. Nauru, the detention camp there, you can look at the pictures yourself and see if it's somewhere that you'd want to be living with your family for an indefinite period of time. And I think that's a big problem as well, is that it causes more harm to the individuals when it's sort of this unknowing on the process. And now that's what they're told. You don't know when you're going to get processed.
If you would like to ask a question, put your hand up and somebody will put a microphone in it down the back there.
Can I start, please, by just questioning when you say about the perception of the masses and Mr. Abbott's repeated use of the phrase illegal, when there is nothing illegal about applying for asylum under the Refugee Convention, which Australia is a signatory to.
Peter, I think that's possibly...
To you.
It's aimed at me. Aimed at me. Well, look, there are arguments about this, and if we had George Brandis, the Shadow Attorney General, he'd answer your question in a legal way. I don't think it's as reprehensible as some people think as a word.
Don't you think it dehumanizes? Don't you think it's part of that?
No, I don't. I think that's unreasonable. I mean, the fact is, people are coming to Australia by boat because they don't believe they'll get here any other way, and that's just the reality of it.
It is factually incorrect, though.
In the US, we like to use undocumented alien, right? If that's any better, I'm not sure.
So it doesn't matter.
Well, I don't think it's the huge issue that you're suggesting it is. I just don't think it is. The Labor Party have used it, we've used it. Some people do, some people don't. Is it really demonising people? The fact is, people that try to get into Australia,
It's not illegal to seek asylum.
Well, if you ask Bob Carr, he says a lot of people are not actually refugees, that they don't have access under the UN Convention, and on his proposition, they are illegal. So, look, but I don't want to sort of argue the technicalities of it. Is it an unreasonable proposition to describe these people, some of whom may qualify, according to Bob Carr, quite a lot shouldn't. It's a very interesting issue. But
it is an interesting development, Dan. Perhaps you'd like to actually talk to that, about the sudden change of heart of the government foreign minister.
I'm trying to avoid putting my foot in my mouth right now.
No, that's put it right there. Yeah. Did it surprise you?
Well, I was surprised only just because of the stats that I'm familiar with. The majority, I think it was 90+%, are actually found to be refugees that are applying and have met the qualification. There are some that don't.
Certainly after a second appeal,
after appeal and through any challenges. So I think that the numbers or statistics are showing that the majority that are getting through, that are coming here, qualify. And so I think we need to recognize that, and that should encourage speeding up the process. If you had the majority who were not meeting the definition, then you might think that there's these alternative motivations for coming to Australia. But I think the process is the biggest frustration for everybody. That's the problem.
What do you think about the people who tear up their passports and papers and things? What do you think should be the reaction to that? Because that is part of the time issue, isn't it?
It is. It's part of the time issues. I mean, I just got a call the other day about some lawyers trying to help a refugee who had a U.S. military ID card to show, look, I had worked with the coalition forces and now where I'm living. And the government's telling him, well, it's probably fraud. You need to prove to us that it was valid. And so how do I've had other cases where, this document for the Pakistani government is a fraud. You have to prove it. And so they're left in this situation of, how would you prove you have a valid driver's license? Well, the government would ask the Vic Roads, and then Vic Roads would have confirmed it. But that's not available to them. They're left in this sort of process where the burden is on them to get answers from other governments, and it's very difficult. But the majority are achieving the goal, and I think if we can just get the process fixed, improve the detention, I think that will reduce a lot of the friction in the system.
Isn't it, Dan? Though, I mean, there are genuine issues there, though, on the timing, and for the Australian authorities to have the time to know as best as they can who they're dealing with.
Absolutely.
And, I was criticised once because I heard an American security guy in Jakarta say that there was a security issue in respect of boat people, and my name was blackened for saying it, but I mean I was just noting the fact that he had made this comment. But in the Senate recently, I think it was the security people said that there were about 58 people in the last couple of years that they'd prefer not to come into Australia. Now, obviously it's terribly difficult. People are illiterate, they don't have papers, and, all these problems. But the Australian public do expect that whatever reasonable might mean by way of process, but some reasonable effort is made to ensure that the people who are coming in are not something other than what we believe them to be. And we had the case recently with Latif, and I tell you what, if you're the minister in charge of security and anything ever happened, you'd never hear the end of it, would you?
No, and I don't think I'm not sure, are people upset that it may take some time to process, or is it more, for me, it's more of the conditions in which they're held. That if they're held in reasonable conditions and they're allowed to live and be with their family that they can, and it may take some time. But you can't tell them we're never going to be able to tell you when you're going to get processed, or it may be years.
Yeah.
I find this phrase that's being thrown around by politicians, "we'll just turn the boats back," frankly, really offensive. There are human beings in those boats. And also, It's as if they're just full of fishing tackle. These boats that will just turn back. And I know for a fact.
Have you got a question?
I know my question is, well, it's multi-layered. There's an asylum seeker sitting next to me here who's only been here for 4 weeks. He's a perfectly legitimate asylum seeker being persecuted by the Taliban back in Kabul. I worked with him in Kabul, and I can tell you, Peter Reith, that there's a lot of development going on in Afghanistan at the moment. And I agree with you, Dan, that what we need to
I'm going to need a question.
Is we need to have development in that country. The troops are pulling out too quickly before enough development has been done to have a legitimate handover.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a comment. Who's next?
Can I just say, though, I mean, honestly, I think it's a fair comment in the sense that it's just a really long, hard road, and particularly for Hazara people. The fact is there are millions of them. I can't remember the number, but there are millions. And, you know, I mean, I've seen, you know, clips of Hazara people being, you know, in a bus, being pulled out and being shot by the side of the road. I mean,
But perhaps that's part of the...
It's a very... I don't know what the answer... But the comment is a fair comment, but I don't... You know, in the end, we can only do so much. I don't know what you do in a place like Afghanistan. It is quite depressing, I'd have to say, from the very reason that this lady's mentioned.
Hi, my question is that don't you think that simply, like mentioned before, reducing the entire thing to numbers, you kind of sort of dehumanize, because there are a lot of sociological consequences also, and also isn't like the Australian government playing a double game? Like on one hand, you are party to certain things in Iraq and Afghanistan which you shouldn't be, and then on the other hand, when people come from there, you're like, well, I'm all clean, I start with a clean slate, so why are you coming? So one, I think that it's not a divine problem. There are definitely solutions to it. It's a man-made problem, and you ought to have solutions. You simply can't say, well, reasonable, in quotes unquotes, well, you got to do more than that. And my plain question is that small things like, say, gender violence that happens during the process when the asylum seekers are coming in, and other all sorts of human rights violations that takes place, you simply ignore if you turn back the boats. That's one. And two, once they are here, how do you plan to tackle such things? Because they are simply not robots that you put them in cabins, you're like, well, I'm done. There's a lot of things that goes on during the process, which I don't think so. You really can't, you aren't doing much about it, especially related to gender violence. Thank you.
Was a lot and several questions in there. Dan, is there something from that you want to...
Well, if I understood, are you talking about the gender violence within the detention centres? Is that what you were talking about? I mean, the detention, conditions of detention are an absolute need to be improved. I mean, that's...
So
the problem is it costs money, and I understand that...
And it could be like, a lot of people don't really know about the conditions are inside there, so either you go open, well, this is how it is, and this is how it ought to be.
Well, that's...
It can't be like, well, it is something, and you're still...
and I mean, the condition of detention is reasons why there's so many groups out there.
Dan, tell us about the conditions that...
Well, I mean, if you want to know, you can look at Nauru and Google Nauru and see the photos.
Yeah, but we can't go there.
And unfortunately, I didn't get to go there. I had to go to Serbia when they all got to go to Nauru. But but if you're being confined, and it's a detention facility for people that maybe majority are legitimate refugees for being persecuted, and then you're putting them in jail. And I know it's a struggle, but the conditions, this gentleman's comment is correct. They need to be properly staffed, and it's expensive, and they need to have a space. You can't, a detention facility. You've seen the pictures. Everyone's seen that. It's the problem is money, right? I mean, that's the reality. If you could house them all in in a beautiful, luxurious estate, there may not be as many problems, but that costs a lot of money.
Peter, is there anything you'd like to take from that question?
Well, I would say this, though. I mean, it's an understandable criticism that that more could be done, or that the sort of edges of some of these debates, when you referred to me using the word what was reasonable, and then admittedly it's very hard to be more precise in some of these discussions that we're having. But, unfortunately, that is the nature of the complex situation that we're facing. Look, it'd be great if we just had an easy answer to it. And unfortunately, there isn't. There is no simple solution. I do think that turning back the boats is certainly a possible solution, but part and parcel of a number of other measures that can be taken.
You can see that for some people, even though the success of stopping the boats, that there are other aspects of it that are, unacceptable, whether it be temporary protection visas or keeping children in prisons.
Well, I mean, the temporary...
where's the give? I suppose my disappointment, my continual disappointment, is there's just a lack. There's no elastic.
But that's not true. I mean, there is an elastic, and that is in the number of people that we take as refugees, and which is why I said to you earlier, I don't see why we couldn't, at the right time, move from 13,000 to 20,000. I mean, that is a huge benefit. And, you mentioned the show that I did last year. You go back to where you came from. One of the really, I thought, outstanding stories was of one of the women who went to Africa to see the women in detention camps there and how they were treated and the lack of hope that they had, because the possibilities for them to come to Australia have been significantly reduced. So I think, again, I just don't think that you can say or suggest that, somehow there isn't a humanitarian element to what we're doing. I think there is. That's not to say it's an easy issue. It's not. Of course, it is a very difficult one, but I don't think we should be sort of thrashing ourselves for a failure to, confront the moral issues. Of course we do. And I'm not talking about politicians. I mean, we as a society. I mean, 250 people here today who are very, very concerned about the issue with good reason. But there's just, it'd be so nice, wouldn't it, if there were black and white issues, resolution of some of these issues. And I'm afraid there aren't. But, people of goodwill have got to battle on and see if they can get a better solution than what we've got now.
Thanks very much to the Wheeler Centre for another great session. Dan, you probably won't be surprised to hear that in Australia, a group that's probably even less highly prized than asylum seekers is lawyers. And you quoted figures of 90% of people getting successful outcomes from their process. There's a cynical view in the community that the Refugee Review Tribunal has been stacked with people who are inclined to give the nod to people. Have you heard that?
I've heard that. And actually, I know some of the judges, but I think it's more of the burden that is placed, as I mentioned earlier, on documents. That's one of the big challenges I've seen, where people are trying to show the proof of a governmental document from another country. How do you do that? It's very difficult. The guy who was trying to validate his military ID that he had issued when he was working with the U.S. forces, his lawyer could write a letter to the Department of Defense, and how quickly do you think they were going to reply, right? Whereas if the Australian government, who's processing them, put a request through the U.S. Embassy, can you validate if this individual worked for this unit? They could get it much quicker. And yet the sort of burden is on this person, and so they don't have anything to prove it. It's a presumptive fraud, and so it's very difficult. And I've seen that with documents coming out of Pakistan, and many of them are I'm sure people are frauding documents. But if you're looking for governmental confirmation of government documents, then the government should go to that government, and it's a much speedier process. There's a process. There is a good review process. Unfortunately, there's, lawyers cost money. And if people that do come here that have money are the lucky ones to get legal help, they may be successful. There's so many, though, that don't get the help because there's just so many. That kind of answers your question, sir?
I used to be one of these people that was satisfied with an organised refugee policy, no racial overtones to it. If they went through the process, I was happy. But people just showing up are not happy.
Just to wrap up, the regional summit that the Indonesian president announced just last week, is that going to be, is a regional approach to this essential to a good outcome, or is it something Australia can go its own way on?
Well, in the end, I mean, Australia is a sovereign country. We'll do what sovereign countries always do, which is pursue what they believe to be in their national interest. And, that's not going to change under the current government or any future government. That's absolutely for certain. There have been many attempts at regional solutions to this. No one can, quibble with the suggestion of having another one, but one would also have to be realistic. The previous lot haven't got us very far, and I'm not sure the next one's going to either. So, fingers crossed. I thought it was, if you don't mind me being political just for 2 seconds, the President of Indonesia is a very sensible man. I've met him. And I thought it was a wise way of managing the issue for the time being, which is not a criticism of him by any means. But it was a fair enough idea under the circumstances from his perspective. Should we put it that way?
And it's got to take a regional solution. The region is the pathway for many of these people traveling through. I mean, very few people that arrive by boat or try to, they've already been in other countries along the journey. And so there's other countries that need to be involved with a potential solution.
Yeah. Well, you've got travel agents basically running the show now. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And wherever they're coming from, they'll just fly in. And, I was told when we were doing the show in the place on the southern, parts of Indonesia there, I was chatting to some of the people who were staying in the hotel where we had one night, overnight, before getting on a boat to try and get to Christmas Island. We were knocked back by the weather. But they were telling me about all the people who were staying in the hotel waiting for their boat. I mean, it really was like a travel arrangement.
It's open and notorious there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem. That's why it's going to take cooperation. Many of these countries are allowing this process to happen where they could be potentially processed in a much better environment.
Well, we will have to wait and see. We'll probably have to wait a long time, I suspect, but I appreciate very much the two of you coming and thrashing this out a bit this evening. Dan Mori and Peter Reith, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for coming along tonight. The Fifth Estate is every second Tuesday evening. We take a issue of the day. We get unlikely pairings, the most interesting people to come and talk to these issues, and appreciate you very much coming along tonight. Have a safe and good night.
Thanks, Peter.